Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to wish you a very happy Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths. And yes, I admit I am once again a couple days tardy with this week's episode, but as the gynecologist once said to the homecoming queen, it's better late than never. For this week's episode, this is the big one. This is the big dog, as the children like to say. As we go back to 1986, June of 1986 to be precise, and talk a little bit about my second favorite album of all time, the immaculate, dare I say, perfect, The Queen is Dead. Now, of course, The Queen is Dead was released on June 16th, 1986. It was produced by Johnny Marr and Morrissey themselves, and as I mentioned just a second ago, this is probably my second favorite album of all time. My favorite album of all time, as I've stated in the past on this channel, is Bone a Drag for a couple of reasons. One being that it just organically is my favorite record of all time. But two, and maybe more importantly, it was the first Morrissey album that I ever got turned on to. It was the first album that I ever owned. So yes, apart from the fact that I legitimately think it is the greatest album of all time, it is, I will admit, a sentimental favorite. But let's say, hypothetically, for a second, that you disqualify Bone a Drag based on its compilation status, which I don't. But let's say you do. I'm willing to play along for a second. That would make my favorite album of all time easily the Smiths' third studio album from 1986, The Queen is Dead. I mean, this album is about as perfect as it gets. There isn't a bad song on this entire album. I would make the argument that there isn't a bad second on this entire album. You can hunt, you can dig, you can rent a truffle hunting hog. It doesn't make any difference. This is basically what perfection sounds like. And what's interesting about this record, at least in my opinion, is even within the Morrissey/Smiths fan community, this is one of those unifying moments between all of us. Now, I've always said, and I maintain, and I believe this to be true, that the Morrissey fan community is as loyal and devout as any other community in the history of rock and roll. But that being said, I would make the argument that we are not necessarily the most close-knit group when it comes to these sort of iconic rock and roll fan bases. Now, I'm not throwing shade at any member of the Morrissey fan community. I love the Morrissey fan community. I'm a very proud member of the Morrissey fan community. I am very proud of the Morrissey fan community. But that being said, we aren't always the tightest knit group in the world. And I think that comes naturally based on the subject of our admiration. Morrissey himself is an individualist. Therefore, I think that most of the people who are drawn to his music are, in fact, individualists, and maybe not always the best members of a community. And for, I think, a lot of us, and I'm only speaking for myself, really, but when you have an artist like Morrissey or the Smiths, whose music and lyrics you connect to on such a personal, spiritual level, almost a scientific level, really, you can't help but be a little bit individualistic when it comes to your fandom. And with that individualism within the Morrissey fan community, I would make the argument that there tends to be, at times, a fair amount of bickering and drama and debate when it comes to Morrissey's catalog and the meaning of a lot of the songs that are in it. But to me, The Queen is Dead is a record that unifies everybody within the Morrissey fan community. I've never met anybody that is a fan of Morrissey or the Smiths that doesn't absolutely worship at the altar of this record. Now, there are a lot of other records in Morrissey's catalog that tend to be a lot more divisive. There are records that I don't necessarily love, that I've gotten heat from people in the past that absolutely love them, and there are records that I love that other people sort of shrug off. So I understand both sides of that, but this is a record, The Queen is Dead, that has brought everybody within the Morrissey fan community together. I've never met one person within our community that has ever said a negative word about this record. Now, that person is probably out there, right? I mean, there has to be that guy out there, just to be the guy who says that this is one of the worst albums Morrissey ever made. I'm sure that guy is out there, but not only, in my opinion, does this record unify the Morrissey fan community, but it is a record that is also very universally celebrated by critics, something that Morrissey, at least especially in his solo career, isn't something that he's always enjoyed. He has not always been the media darling, especially over the last several years, as people have gone into this sort of campaign to try to cancel him. But this is a record, The Queen is Dead, that is universally celebrated by both fans and the sort of music press. In 2013, as a matter of fact, the NME ranked this as being the greatest album of all time. Now, there are clearly some people working at the NME that have some solid heads on their shoulders. I would make the argument in 2020, Rolling Stone, for whatever their opinion is worth. I don't tend to hold a lot of value in what Rolling Stone says, but in 2020 they ranked The Queen is Dead as number 113 out of their top 500 albums of all time. I think that is a fairly respectable showing, considering the source being Rolling Stone. But most recently, and the one that I have to sort of take, exception with, is this past year, Apple Music ranked this record as number 66 on their top 100 records of all time. Now, you think to yourself, well, 66 out of 100 isn't terrible. At least it showed up, which I sort of agree with that. But if you go back and you look at a lot of the records that ranked a lot higher than The Queen is Dead on the Apple Music ranking, that's sort of where I take exception. It's my opinion that Apple Music used their list of 100 greatest albums of all time to make sort of a political statement, which is fine in a way, but I don't always think that is the most appropriate arena in order to sort of make a political statement, especially if you go and you look at the record that Apple Music ranked as the greatest album of all time, which is The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Now, I have nothing against Lauryn Hill personally, and I mean no disrespect by saying this, but this was a record, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, that until this Apple Music ranking came out last year, or earlier this year, whatever it was, I had never even heard it. Now, I'd seen the album cover, and I sort of knew who Lauryn Hill was based on her affiliation with the Fugees, but it was a record that I had never listened to, and I went back and tried to listen to it after Apple Music ranked it as the greatest album of all time. And maybe this is just me, but to be perfectly honest with you, I couldn't even get through that record. That record is not very good, at least in my opinion. So for Apple Music to say that is the greatest album of all time, at least in my estimation, comes across as being sort of a political statement. Now, I'm not going to sit here and make the argument that The Queen is Dead should be their greatest album out of 100. Now, I would make the argument that it is, and it should be, therefore it should be. But if you're going to pick an album, I talked about this a couple weeks ago when I was talking about the ranking of David Bowie that I did. To me, the greatest album of all time, in terms of its importance, is The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. To me, that is the most important album ever recorded. Now, I think that The Queen is Dead personally is better, as I think Morrissey and the Smiths are slightly better than David Bowie. David Bowie being my second favorite recording artist of all time. It's not necessarily neck and neck. Morrissey is way up here and Bowie's still down here. But if you're going to rank one album as the greatest of all time out of 100, if you're not going to go with something like The Queen is Dead, then in my opinion, you got to go with The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. Again, I mean no disrespect to Lauryn Hill, but that record is not good, at least in my opinion. I couldn't even get all the way through that record. Anyway, let's get into this record just a little bit. As I mentioned before, this record was released on June 16th, 1986, produced by Johnny Marr and Morrissey. And to me, I mean, like I said before, this record is pretty much absolutely perfect. I think every single song on this record is as good as anything that the band ever did. Now, I've always maintained that as far as talking about the 4 official studio albums by the band, they sort of, in chronological order, they sort of get better. Now, starting in 1984, the Smiths' solo or self-titled debut album, to me, is the greatest debut album of all time, hands down. I don't think it's even close, but within the confines of the Smiths' catalog, to me, it is the weakest. And I say the word weakest extremely loosely. Back on the very first episode of Archaic Records on this channel, when I ranked the studio albums of Morrissey, all 4 of the Smiths albums were in the top 10. So I'm not throwing shade. And honestly, I think if, the Smiths self-titled album from 1984 is your weakest, I mean, I think that's really saying something, because it is the greatest debut album of all time. After that, Meat is Murder, which is just brilliant. I mean, start to finish, it again, like The Queen is Dead, is almost a perfect album. But to me, I would rank that one as the 3rd best. And again, if Meat is Murder is your 3rd best out of 4 albums, I mean, that is staggering, at least to me. Now, while I think that in a lot of ways, Strange Ways, Here We Come is as good, or in a few cases even better, than The Queen is Dead, to me, these 2 albums are very, very close, in terms of which one I like better. But I've always said this, when it comes down to the tie-breaking element between The Queen is Dead and Strange Ways, Here We Come, it is the song Girlfriend in a Coma. And I've said this before, I don't hate the song Girlfriend in a Coma. It's a song that I think is fine. It doesn't really bother me. I don't take offense to it, but it's just one of those songs that I've never loved from the first time I ever heard it till the next time I hear it, probably later today or tomorrow. It's a song that I just have never loved. It's sort of a novelty, and dare I say, it's a song that when I go see Morrissey live, it's one that I consciously sort of hope to avoid. Now, I was watching these shows out in Las Vegas over the past weekend, or a couple weeks ago, and I said this at the time when I talked about those shows, in my last Morrissey Monday video, that, Morrissey created, or he sort of committed the ultimate faux pas, at least in my experience, or at least in my opinion, when it comes to seeing Morrissey live, and that is that you are not allowed to play both Girlfriend in a Coma and You're the One for Me Fatty on the same night, because You're the One for Me Fatty, although it's, again, not a song I hate, it's a decent track, but, it's basically the solo equivalent to Girlfriend in a Coma, which is a song that, I just kind of get burnt out on. And like I said, when I go see him live, it's one of those songs I sort of hope to avoid. And when it comes to the tie-breaking element between Strange Ways, Here We Come and The Queen's Dead, to me that is the tiebreaker. So if I had to pick a favorite album out of the Smiths catalog, like I said, it's my second favorite album of all time. It is The Queen is Dead. This is a record that I still listen to, weekly. More than weekly. I still listen to this record. More than weekly. I remember the first time I actually bought this record on CD. I took it home, I listened to it, and to say it blew my mind is an understatement. This album is a life changer. The first time you listen to The Queen is Dead, you don't come back the same person as you went into it, son, it's just impossible. This album literally changed my life as much or more than any other album in Morrissey's catalog, probably with the exception, like I said, of Bone a Drag, which is the only album in Morrissey's catalog that I like a little bit better. Of course, the album features the striking sort of signature Smiths artwork. Their artwork is always beautiful and as timeless as the music itself. Now, of course, this album cover has been in the news over the past few days because coincidentally, and this is a record I was planning on talking about all week before the news came out of the passing of Alain Delon at the age of 88. Of course, this photograph was taken from a film from 1964 called The Unvanquished, in English at least. I will never be able to pronounce the actual name of the film, so I will just say The Unvanquished. But Alain Delon just passed away this past weekend at the age of 88. As I was reading the story about his passing, I noticed that the first comment on the social media page that ran the story basically said, "What happened?" And with all due respect to Mr. Delon, the first thing that I thought of was he was 88. I mean, 88 happened. That's what happened. First off, I don't always agree with the idea that we need to know what happens to these people when they pass away. I think that even a public figure like Alain Delon is, entitled to a little bit of privacy. So when I see that people pass away, it isn't always my natural instinct to wonder what happened. You just sort of mourn the loss of this individual that is on the cover of my second favorite album of all time. I have seen the movie, The Unvanquished. Now, I have not seen a lot of the movies that Morrissey makes reference to in some of his music. I actually really like this movie a lot. And like I said, the guy was 88 years old. Now, if the guy was in his 60s, you would think, yeah, that's tragic, He seems so young. But for me, the threshold is right around 80. If somebody passes away at 80 or beyond, you think, yeah, seems about right. They had a full run. Anything before the age of before the age of 80, you think, yeah, it's a little sad. Seems a little young. But at 88 years old, what were you going to do between 88 and 100 that you couldn't have done between 0 and 88, at least in my opinion. But rest in peace, Alain Delon. Of the Smiths album covers, I've always maintained that the Smiths self-titled debut album is my favorite album cover in Morrissey's catalog. It's probably my favorite album cover of all time, but I love the artwork on this record. And again, Alain Delon just passed away this week. Anyway, the first song on this record is the title track, The Queen is Dead, and every time I listen to this record, it never fails. As soon as I hear the intro to take me back to Oh Dear Old Blighty by Cicely Courtnidge, every time I listen to this record, it literally still gives me the chills. I think it is one of the coolest intros to any album, any song that I've ever heard. Now, of course, The Queen is Dead is basically a perfect song, according to Johnny Marr. When it comes to the song's sort of unique sound coming out of the rhythm section, Johnny Marr has talked about how they used at the time, what was at the time technology, to give the rhythm section sort of a unique sound. On that record, I've talked about this in the past when it comes to the rhythm section. You don't hear this so much with Andy Rourke as being dismissed as a bassist. I think that most people sort of accept Andy Rourke as being a legitimate bass icon in terms of his place in rock and roll, but I always get frustrated when I hear people dismiss Mike Joyce, and I think his playing on this record is just the jugs. And I love this song. Of course, this song talks a lot about Morrissey's sort of well-documented opinion on the royal family. I've heard somebody talk, I read one time where somebody said this song was about the sort of codependent relationship between Britain and the royal family. I know part of this song also touches on Morrissey's very well-documented, very close relationship with his mother. Part of this song was also inspired by the actions of a guy by the name of Michael Fagan, who in 1982 broke into Buckingham Palace and actually worked his way all the way into the Queen's bedroom, where he apparently held an audience with her for a few minutes before actually being taken away by Buckingham Palace security. And one thing I got to mention every time I listen to this album, also before I get more into the songs, is now I've never been a musician. I'm not a musical person in that sense. I've never been in a band. I've never recorded a record. But one thing I wonder, when you're talking about a record that is basically this perfect on this level, when you are in the studio as a member of the band or the production team, are you aware of what you are creating? Are you aware that you are giving birth to something truly special? Because I believe personally, and I've said this before in the past, I believe that when bands and artists put out records that are junk, sort of referring to the newest album by Iggy Pop, an album I've talked about a few times on this channel, and I don't want to shovel a bunch of shit at it, but that record is garbage, in my opinion. And I believe in my heart that Iggy Pop knows that record is no good, because Iggy Pop has put out some of the greatest music in the history of this genre. So I suspect that he knows that record isn't necessarily up to his standard. Now, on the flip side of that coin, when you are making a record that is basically perfect, are you aware of how special these recording sessions are? If I ever got an opportunity to interview Morrissey or Marr or Mike Joyce, that would be one of the first questions I would ask him in regards to this record was, did you know that this record was going to turn out to be basically a perfect album? Now, as far as the song The Queen is Dead, as an American, I guess I'm saying this as through the lens of like the way I see the world. I've never really understood the whole thing with the royal family. Now, I've had a lot of acquaintances and people I've known in the past that were really super into the royal family. It's something that just doesn't really interest me. Now, obviously, I understand if you grow up in Britain, it's probably a lot more a part of your daily life. But I remember specifically where I was when the whole thing happened with Princess Diana. I was on a family vacation with a girlfriend of mine and her parents, and we were up in Lake Tahoe, California, because her parents had like a cabin up at Lake Tahoe, and the news came out about Princess Diana dying in that car accident. And I didn't know this until this news came out, but my ex-girlfriend's mom was just a royal fanatic, and she sobbed for the entire weekend. She basically went and shut herself in her bedroom and wouldn't come out the entire weekend after she found out that Princess Diana passed away. As an American, I guess I just don't really see things that way. I'm not particularly interested or fascinated by the royal family. I always love hearing Morrissey's opinions on the royal family because they are not very favorable. This is one of the greatest songs of all time. This is one of those songs I never get tired of hearing. Doesn't matter how many times. I don't really think there's a song on this entire album that I ever get tired of hearing. There isn't one piece of skippage on this album, in my opinion. The next song after that is Frankly Mr. Shankly. According to what I've read, this song is about Jeff Travis, who at the time was the head of Rough Trade. Morrissey was discontent. I know it's hard to imagine Morrissey being discontent, but Morrissey was discontent with the deal that the band had at Rough Trade and decided that it would be a good idea to pen a song lampooning the band's former boss. And according to Jeff Travis, he has always maintained that he and Morrissey were really good friends back during this era. But if you go back and you read Morrissey's autobiography, he sort of paints that relationship in a different light. I absolutely love the song Frankly Mr. Shankly. It has it's just dripping with Morrissey's, sarcastic wit. It has a very serrated edge. I love when he takes a shot at Jeff Travis's poetry, which was something that apparently Jeff Travis was a bit of an amateur poet, and he used to, give his writings to Morrissey to sort of get feedback and see what Morrissey thought of his poetry. And after listening to the song, Frankly, Mr. Shankly, you don't have to wonder what Morrissey thought of his poetry. One of the lyrics in this song that always throws me off is when Morrissey refers to the main character, Mr. Shankly, as a flatulent pain in the ass. And it sort of always catches me off guard, especially the first time I ever heard the song, because you always think of Morrissey, or at least I think of Morrissey, as being sort of top shelf, right? He's a little bit snitty, he's a little bit prissy, he's a little bit highbrow, and you don't really think of Morrissey, not saying that this is a fart joke necessarily, but you don't really ever think of Morrissey as even referencing bodily functions. I have a friend who told me that one of his favorite, or least favorite, Morrissey songs is the song America's Not the World, because Morrissey references hamburgers in that song, and he said it just sounds weird, the word hamburger coming from Morrissey, because Morrissey is so, sort of top shelf. And I always make that same observation when it comes to him using the word flatulent in the song Frankly Mr. Shankly, because Morrissey, being not mortal, in my opinion, not being one of us, I can't imagine Morrissey just sitting on the couch and just tearing one off after a nice, satisfying vegan meal, which he probably does, to be honest with you, because I don't know how much time you've spent hanging around with vegans, but vegans' gas can kill an elk, son. So, just saying. But I don't picture Morrissey in that light. I don't even see him as human. Yes, I realize that I'm an embarrassing fanboy. All right, the next song after that is, one of my favorite songs. This might be a top 20 of all time. That's the song I Know It's Over. Apparently this song is about somebody that has lived basically a loveless life, and how it would basically be better to die than to live a life that feels as empty as this. This is one of the most beautifully written songs in Morrissey's entire catalog. One of my favorite versions of this song, which I love, the studio version of I Know It's Over, but the live version on Rank is the jugs, son. This is one of the best live songs in the Smiths' entire catalog. Man, if I had to pick a favorite song off The Queen is Dead, it's impossible, basically, but I think I Know It's Over would be in the running. The next song after that is Never Had No One Ever. Sort of self-explanatory. I think this song is a lot like I Know It's Over, but it feels even more hopeless, if possible. I feel like I Know It's Over is sort of this is sort of the sequel to I Know It's Over. And the person in the song, Never Had No One Ever, is basically just completely given up. I love this song. The next song after that is Cemetery Gates, which this is going to get pretty repetitive, I acknowledge, but it's one of the greatest songs ever written. This song always makes me think of one of my favorite pastimes, which is visiting old cemeteries. Now, I live in the United States, so you use the term old cemeteries in sort of air quotes. My wife and I lived in New Orleans for 2 years, and one of my favorite things about New Orleans, which New Orleans is one of my favorite cities. Now, in honesty, it wasn't necessarily my favorite place that I've ever lived, although I still love the city. To live in New Orleans is challenging. It was challenging, at least for us, more challenging than it was worth it at the end of the day, I would argue. But one of my favorite things about the city is the cemeteries there. The cemeteries are At least for American standards, they are very old. Everything is above ground. They're very, they're very gothic. You can really kind of get lost walking around the cemeteries in New Orleans. Now, unfortunately, because of vandalism and other sort of treachery that goes on inside the cemeteries in New Orleans, last time I was down there, the cemeteries have very abbreviated hours, and you're not really supposed to just kind of wander around on your own as much as you used to. Somebody told me recently that you actually have to sort of take tours of the cemeteries in New Orleans. I'm not saying that that is necessarily true. That's just what somebody told me. But one of my favorite things about going anywhere is exploring these old cemeteries. My wife and I, a few years ago, were down in a place called Scottsboro, Alabama, which the reason why we went down to Scottsboro, Alabama is because there is this big sort of thrift store supercenter called the Unclaimed Baggage Center, which is basically what it sounds like. It is a place where airlines send luggage that goes unclaimed at carousels after people travel. And the reason why we went down specifically to check out this Unclaimed Baggage Center, one, because my wife is the thrift queen and she loves going to any thrift store, but two, the main reason was because my wife and I, one of our favorite movies is The Labyrinth. Now, my wife, I think it might actually be her favorite movie of all time. I don't think that I would make that statement necessarily, but I do love The Labyrinth. And one of the puppets from The Labyrinth, one of the Muppets, Hoggle, apparently at some point in time in his travels went unclaimed at an airport somewhere in the United States. And he ended up living in this Unclaimed Baggage Center in Scottsboro, Alabama. And Scottsboro, Alabama, by the way, is this town that is literally in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this town is 2 miles past who gives a shit, if you know what I mean. So I have no idea why they built this huge thrift mall in the middle of nowhere. And I have no idea why the airlines decided that this was where they were going to ship all of these bags, I should say. But we go down there to see Hoggle, and behind the thrift store is this little town cemetery, which is just beautiful. And so we make a point. It's like, okay, after we go through this thrift store, we're going to go check out this cemetery. And so we go through the thrift store, and it was pretty snug, but, my wife is the thrift queen. I could sort of take it or leave it. So I'm actually more excited to go check out the cemetery. So we go out and we're wandering around this little town cemetery in Scottsboro, Alabama. We're the only two people in there. And all of a sudden, this little old lady rolls up in this car. And the first thing I think, because we're in a very rural area, and my wife and I look sort of out of place compared to most of the locals that we had seen down there. So the first thing I think of is she's going to come either kick us out, or she's going to call the police, or she's going to want to know what we're doing. And she comes up to us and she asks us, she's like, "Hey, are you looking for anybody specific?" And my wife and I were like, "No, we don't live here. We're just kind of like checking out the little cemetery." And she basically told us, she's like, "Hold on for a second." She ran back to her car and she brought us out this map basically of who all of these people in the cemetery were. And on the spot, she gave us this little sort of impromptu tour, telling us about who all these people were in this little town of Scottsboro, Alabama. It actually turned out to be one of my favorite little weird experiences I've ever had, because this lady was so excited about the cemetery. She was the caretaker. She loved her little town. She knew the whole history, and she basically gave us a free, 20-minute tour of all of the people that had lived in that town and the history of the town. And I actually thought it turned out to be awesome. It's one of my favorite things about going through cemeteries is, trying to figure out, it's one thing just to see people's names and their postscript, but, to try to put in your head, figure out who these people were. It was so cool to have this lady tell us about this little town that we haven't been back to since. And like I said, I've never, I've lived in the United States my whole life. I've never even been to Europe or the UK. And one of my, dream bucket list trips is to go anywhere in Europe, really. But I know if I ever get the opportunity to do it, one of the things I want to do most is go check out some really old European cemeteries, because like I said, the cemeteries over here are definitely snug, but they're, it's all old only according to like American standards. The song Cemetery Gates is perfect. I mean, you can't argue with that song. The next song after that is a song called Big Mouth Strikes Again. I think this song is actually written about Morrissey himself and how he's always sort of getting himself in trouble over his insistence on spouting off his opinions. To me, this song is as relevant today as it was in 1986. If you accept that that is what this song is all about. I mean, as we've talked about on this channel in the past, we live in an age right now where conformity it's basically like a religion. It actually sort of, frightens me. The way that people hold conformity in such high regard. And we live in an age right now where if you dare to voice a dissenting opinion with what the masses think, you really risk being outed and being, canceled, which is something that, of course, as we've all seen over the past several years, is something that Morrissey has sort of had to experience, going and having people try to cancel him based on the fact that he refuses to drink the conformity Kool-Aid. Morrissey insists on practicing individualism. I mean, how dare you have an opinion that other people disagree with? Now, I say this as an old guy. I get it. But I remember distinctly a time in our society where it was okay to have sort of a dissenting opinion than people around you, and you could still actually be friends with them. You could still have a civilized conversation. You could discuss it intellectually, and you may not change each other's minds, but you could at least sort of see where each other were coming from. This is something that I fear we are lacking in our society now. People nowadays don't actually go out and have conversations with their neighbors. They only live socially. It seems that people are living more and more on social media. I have a job. I'm fortunate in the sense, unfortunate depending on the day, but I'm fortunate in the sense that I have a job where I am forced to interact with people every single day. And in my experience, in my personal opinion, people aren't necessarily as polarized as it is portrayed in the media. I think that most people, whether you agree or disagree with their politics or their religion or their sports team, most people, I genuinely think, are just good people. They're trying to go out there, they're trying to put some bread on the table, put some money in the bank, and put their kids through school. I genuinely think that's what most people are out there trying to do every day. And I'm fortunate, like I said, in the sense I have to go out and I have to talk to people in my community every day. I don't have a real polarizing opinion of people. I don't have the opinion that people are as polarized as it comes across in the media. I think that most people, regardless, of who you support politically, I think most people are generally semi-decent human beings. But, that's the thing that scares me about the society we live in now is, conformity is religion. And it seems to me, especially, people on the left are the ones that are the thought police and the book burners. And as a kid growing up, I always associated that with people who were more sort of like on the right wing, people who were sort of trying to censor what you thought and what you believed. And I mean, I'm not saying this as if I'm somebody that's ever been canceled. Nobody cares what I think because I am a toad. But I can't imagine what it's like being somebody like Morrissey who, based on the fact that he is not going to play the conformity card, he's always going to stand up for what he believes. He's always going to spout his opinions. That he's had to be, he's had this campaign launched against him. I mentioned this story in the past. I was at a record store not too long ago here in Nashville, and I was wearing a Morrissey shirt, and I was thumbing through some records, and this guy was walking past me, and he did the drive-by where he made a comment directed at me, but he didn't even stop to engage me in conversation. So as I was sitting there flipping through the records, he went behind me and very quickly and very cowardly, I would say, said, "Morrissey's a Nazi!" And I turned around, not that I was going to, fight him, but I'm not really a fighter, but I was willing to engage him in conversation. But the dude was like 2 aisles over by the time I turned around. I was like, not even worth really having a conversation if you're that much of a coward. And I want to know, how is Morrissey a Nazi? Because he doesn't agree with everything that you believe in? Anyway, I love the song Big Mouth Strikes Again. That was a long sort of rant, I admit, but I love the song Big Mouth Strikes Again. The next song after that is The Boy with the Thorn in His Side. I saw an interview with Morrissey on YouTube that was filmed many years ago, and he talked about how this song was about the music industry and mainstream radio, and basically his frustration at the time with mainstream radio's refusal to basically play records by the Smiths. I love the song The Boy with a Thorn in His Side. After that is Vicar in a Tutu, which according to Morrissey, this song was inspired by a cross-dressing comedian that he used to know. I think that this song is about the church's relationship with homosexuality, which I'm not a churchgoer. I never really have been. But I have the opinion now that the church is starting to sort of come around in regards to its relationship with the homosexual community, which I think is a important big step. I'm not necessarily the world's biggest practitioner of prayer, but I am all in favor of inclusion when it comes to things like that. I love the song Vicar in a Tutu, but you can't even really say it, right? I guess if I had to pick a least favorite song off The Queen's Dead, that doesn't really exist, but if I had to pick a least favorite song, gun to head type scenario, it'd probably be Vicar in a Tutu. The next song after that is, just perfection again. There's a Light That Never Goes Out. Probably one of the most well-known songs in the entire Smiths catalog. I would make the argument that probably right behind How Soon Is Now and maybe This Charming Man. Although There's a Light That Never Goes Out might outrank This Charming Man. I think How Soon Is Now is always going to be the Smiths' biggest, at least most well-known song. To me, I sort of interpret the song as being about somebody who basically just doesn't want to go home at the end of the day. They live in a situation that is not a comfortable place to come home to, when your day is finished. And unfortunately, I've been in this situation a couple times. I remember as a kid in high school, there was a time in my life when my home life was very tumultuous. On its best day, it was chaotic, and on its worst day, it was something much more sinister. And I remember there were days, especially my first 2 years in high school, where I walked to and from school every day because the town that I lived in was so small that you could basically walk from point A to point B in no time whatsoever, and I didn't want to deal with the school bus, and I didn't really want to be around my classmates any longer than I had to be. And there were days when things were in a pretty poor state in my house that I would literally walk for hours before I got home, because once I got home, it was on, and regardless of what time I got home, it didn't really matter to the people that were living there, because it could have been, I was not really missed throughout the day, I guess I'll say. So whenever I got home, I just got home. So I used to, just walk for hours, just not wanting to go home. And there was a point in my adult life also where I was living with an ex-girlfriend who was pretty gnarly, and I'm not saying this to cast stones at anybody who is not here to defend themselves, but there was a situation I was living in for 5 years with an ex-girlfriend that I would do anything it took at the end of the workday not to go home at night. If it meant going out and hanging out with friends, which was fun, that was fine. If it meant doing the same thing, basically walking around Seattle for hours, literally sometimes hours, just not wanting to go home, that's what this song always makes me think of. Again, when I do these sort of interpretations, I'm not saying that this is what was intended when it was written. It's just sort of how I interpret it. But every time I hear the song, There's a Light That Never Goes Out, it doesn't matter how many times I've heard it. This is a song that I never get tired of. That's kind of what it makes me think of. It makes me think of being a kid and just walking the streets after school, just doing anything to avoid going home into the chaos that was awaiting you there. The last song on this record is another classic. Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others. Somebody one time sort of criticized me, which is not hard to believe if you watch these videos, but one time somebody criticized me for loving this song based on the fact that I don't love the song You're the One for Me, Fatty, because basically he said that this song is essentially the same thing as You're the One for Me, Fatty, and Girlfriend in Coma, that it's kind of a novelty song. I disagree. I really love this song. I read one time that this song was sort of about Morrissey's disdain for locker room chatter. You know, when you walk into a situation where it's all men, whether it's like a locker room or a barbershop or something like that, and guys are sitting around having locker room chat and they are discussing their sexual escapades and women that they fantasize about. And I could sort of see how the song could be about that. It's hard to imagine Morrissey partaking in, a casual game of locker room chat. Now, it's not necessarily my favorite pastime as well, though I have to acknowledge that I have participated in my share of locker room chatter from time to time. I have worked in situations in the past where it's basically a guy's club, and this is what happens when you're working in a guy's club. Guys start ending up talking about women, and it's just kind of what happens. But really, what I actually think this song is about is breasts. I mean, maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but this song is about jugs. And it is the jugs. That's sort of at least the way that I interpret this song. When I was talking earlier about participating in locker room chatter, I have to bring this up because it sort of illustrates the point of what a dork I was in high school. But my best friend, Tim, and I in high school, we would have our own sort of sad, version of locker room chatter, but it involved heroines in the Marvel Universe, because we knew that the girls in our high school were sort of unattainable. But we would sit around and we would talk about the girls in the Marvel Universe, the heroines. I remember that in particular, his fancy was Rogue from the X-Men, and my heartthrob was Circe from the Avengers. And we used to butt heads over that topic constantly. But to me, I think that this song is basically about breasts. It's proof that Morrissey can be a little bit of a guy in the sense that he just loves jugs. Now, I don't really think that the song is about jugs, but I thought it was kind of funny. Anyway, it closes out what is my second favorite album of all time. Sometimes I feel like there just isn't anything that needs to be said further when you listen to The Queen is Dead than just going back and listening to it. And if you are a fan of Morrissey and the Smiths, I'm sure that this is a record that you love. Like I said before, this is a record that unifies all of the members of Morrissey's fan community. This is a record that there really just is no debate over. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be your first or second favorite album in the catalog, but this is a record that, if you don't like The Queen is Dead, I have no idea what you're doing here. I mean, this is as good as it gets. A couple quick notes real quick. One being that today is August 21st, 2024, and I was just checking out some news online before I got on here to record this video. Apparently today is the Birthday of the single, Dagenham Dave, off of the 1995 album Southpaw Grammar. Unlike The Queen is Dead, Southpaw Grammar is probably my least favorite album in the Morrissey catalog. And as I talked about earlier, all of this sort of infighting and debating that happens sometimes within the Morrissey fan community, I have been criticized soundly for my opinion on Southpaw Grammar being my least favorite album in the Morrissey catalog, but it just is. I was actually listening to Southpaw Grammar just a couple days ago because I listened to it fairly infrequently, I would make the argument. But I put it on recently because every time I hear it, I want to give it more of a chance. I want to like this record more than I do, but still, it just, I mean, it's got like 3 or 4 good songs on it, but the rest of it, to me, is not that great. And the song Dagenham Dave in particular, which somebody one time told me in the comments on this channel that they thought that Dagenham Dave was one of Morrissey's best songs. Man, I couldn't possibly disagree with that anymore. To me, that song is just basically like just repetitive. It's just the chorus over and over again. But anyway, happy birthday to the single Dagenham Dave, which came out on this day in 1995. Of course, the record would come out a week later. I believe on, I think it came out on August 28th, so not quite a week later. But anyway, happy birthday to Dagenham Dave. Apart from that, I'm just sitting around here waiting for November 6th and 7th in Birmingham, Alabama, and Knoxville, Tennessee. If those shows that Morrissey performed in Las Vegas are any indication, I think that these shows are going to be the height of snuggery. But apart from that, and before that, actually, coming up in just about a month, heading out to San Francisco to see Johnny Marr at the Warfield in San Francisco with James. Absolutely cannot wait for that Johnny Marr show. When I get back from that show in San Francisco, I will be doing a full sort of show recap. Also, that same week is the week that the Boom Slang reissue comes out, which is, in a way, Johnny Marr's first solo album. I did a full episode on the Boom Slang record earlier in the history of this channel, if you are interested. Also, I've gotten in the habit with these Morrissey Mondays of doing them every other week, which I'm okay with, assuming they're on time, which of course they never are. I'm 2 days late this week again, but I have managed to free up a little bit of time in my real world work life on Mondays, so I'm hoping that we will be able to get these back up on Monday and the more sort of regular schedule. I realize you just pissed your pants with excitement having heard that, so I will leave you now and let you towel off. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And that's going to do her. So until next time, my friends, talk to you then.